Shabbat Shalom. I love traveling. Some of you probably already know that. Those of you that know anything about my family know that we have international connections. And as much as I love to travel around the US, I also love to go internationally, which means that I also have the great joy of going through immigrations and customs controls in a variety of different venues, whether they be in the Orlando airport, whether they be in some other part of the world. It's a lot of fun. And you get to walk through the whole duty-free section. It's an experience that goes on top of whatever it is you're actually traveling for. But I have to ask, and I'm not going to ask for a show of hands because who knows who's watching, has anybody here ever been in one of those situations, talking to the immigration officer, walking through the duties, filling out the little form, and you weren't 100% accurate? Maybe you left off that you were carrying an extra bottle of something for a relative. Maybe that you did actually have some fresh produce that was really, really special from the country you were coming from and you were not about to dump it in the trash. Maybe you had accidentally, on purpose, bought something at a good price that you didn't want to declare because then you'd have to pay duties on it. Maybe you've been in that situation at one point or another. Well, are you a good Jew or not for deceiving those border officials in our country or others? Well, let's see if you're in good company or not. Abraham and Sarah, did they ever have to deal with border patrols? Absolutely. And what did Abraham say about Sarah when he came across the border patrol and was afraid for how they might deal with them? She's my sister. He lied. He lied to government officials in Egypt. And he did it again when he went down into the Philistine territory. He lied a second time in the exact same way. It worked once. Why not use it again? It's a good way to get through the border control without having too much trouble like being murdered for your wife. So, yes, absolutely. Now, that's the most obvious form of, shall we say, falsifying records as he comes across the border in two different instances. But what about the rest of our ancestors? Did they have much reason to travel internationally and often under difficult circumstances? Well, Isaac does exactly the same thing with Rebekah. Also shows up in the Philistine territory, also uses the same ruse that she is my sister. There gets caught out because he is found dallying with his sister, and they're like, whoa, hold on, dude, that's not what we do with our sister. And he's like, no, it's actually my wife. And they said, well, wait, you lied. And the story unfolds from there. And then, of course, what happens to Isaac's children? What happens to Jacob? His life is a life of emigration and immigration. He spends the middle part of his life as an expat, having to flee from his brother's murderous intentions, ending up a penniless wanderer in the Assyrian territory, what we would now call Syria, and working for his uncle who mistreats him, abuses him as a vulnerable worker, changes his wages, doesn't give him the proper bride that he's looking for, and eventually he has to run from that, comes back into the land of Israel and has more trouble there, and eventually gets pushed into a famine. And what happens in the height of that famine? Jacob and sons move south. By move south, I mean all the way down into Egypt. Now, it's lucky that they already knew somebody there, that they had a relative already working in the government, and that person was able to give them a good visa to get in and stay. And how well did that work out long term? Well, we're still dealing with it in this week's parashah. We are still talking about Yetziat Mitzrayim, the leaving of Egypt, and we are now, as happy as we are to be out of Egypt, and happy as we are celebrating the giving of the Ten Commandments, the Torah, and our destiny in front of us, we are homeless refugees in this Torah portion. Doesn't feel like it because we own it and because we know how the story ends. But for our ancestors at that moment, they were homeless refugees. They had already been attacked once by the Amalekites, and they knew that there were struggles up ahead for them to reclaim their home back in the land of Israel, well, what will become called Israel. But at the moment, they don't know how it's going to work out. They are homeless refugees, literally living in shacks We even call those shacks by a fancy name and named an entire holiday after them, called Sukkot. So yeah, that's where we are in our Jewish history. And you're probably thinking, but this is just biblical. This is the old days. Do I have to talk about the Babylonian exile? Do I have to talk about the Roman diaspora? Do I have to talk about the number of times that we were driven out of European country after country after country? Hundreds of different expulsions from towns, regions, and countries throughout Europe at different points over the last couple thousand years. How many of you have family that came to the United States from somewhere else? That is to say, anybody here not indigenous and came across with indigenous people? There should be every hand going up because very few of us actually have indigenous ancestry, and even if we do, it is unlikely that is 100% of our ancestry, which means someone in our family made the trek to get to this continent at some point in the last 500 years rather than in the last 20,000 or 40,000 or 60,000 years, depending upon your research on the anthropology of Native Americans. But that's a whole nother conversation. So, when did the bulk of Jews come to the United States? Anybody know those dates? What is the window of Jewish immigration to the United States? What's that? 1890, it starts picking up. Right? 1890, it starts picking up. Prior to that, there were about 250,000 Jews in the entire United States. And by 1924, there were over 3 million Jews in the United States. Put that in perspective. In about 40 years, the Jewish population went from 250,000 to over 3 million. And it would have gone higher. I picked 1924 not as a random number, but as a very critical number. Because what happened in 1924 that changed that whole process? In 1924 was the Giant Immigration Act, which, despite the name, was basically De-Immigration Act. That is to say, this act was passed with the support of the eugenicists, who believed that America was being poisoned in its blood by the influx of immigrants, including us, the Jews, and that we were changing the character of America. And so therefore we had to stop immigration as we knew it. And that meant that they would institute a quota system, that only a certain number of people would be allowed in from each country in order to keep the proper ratio of the balance of peoples in the United States, lest a group comes in large number and taints our population or taints our culture. But where to pick that number for the magic ratio? It's 1924. We just had the 1920 census. The obvious answer would be to use the 1920 census, correct? But then you've got a problem. Now you're going to have to allow in a much higher ratio of all of those Eastern European lowlifes and Southern Europeans. Don't worry, we've already excluded all of the Chinese, Japanese, and other people from Asia back in 1880, so we don't have to worry about them, because we already made laws barring them from coming into our country a long time ago. But if we pick 1920 as our base point for the percentages, then we are going to have a problem, say the architects of this bill, which passed with almost unanimous support, I might add. Instead, let's go back to the 1880 census. Those were the good old days, before we had too many of these undesirable foreigners, and we were mostly British with some German and other groups mixed in, and those will be the proportions we will use. Makes perfect sense if you already have in mind the kind of people you want in your country and can somehow predict who is going to be useful and relevant. Turns out that doing this crashed American innovation. The number of patents being filed and the number of new jobs being created cratered. Probably not surprisingly that there would be also a depression only 5 years later after all of this began. But more personally, for those of us who are Jewish, what was the impact of this immigration decision for our people? We were left in Europe. millions died. Millions of Jews wanted to come to the United States. They were still coming in huge numbers. That was one of the alarming things that this act was meant to stop. And stop it, it did. And that meant that millions of Jews stayed in communist Russia, stayed in Eastern Europe, and were there thus when World War II broke out, and were slaughtered in the millions when they would have had a place to go had this policy not been enacted. Remember, even Hitler himself recognized this issue and sent a boatload of Jews to American shores on the eve of World War II to show that America didn't want us either. And those Jews were eventually put back on the boat to Germany and died. This is what that decision had. This decision meant that millions of our brothers and sisters perished, lest we change the culture of the United States. Now, to be fair, have we changed the culture of the United States? Yeah. Guess what? We have. Is that a bad thing? Is there a particular point in American history that had the perfect cultural mix to which we must always adhere, that we must use as our North Star for deciding exactly what our culture should be? Are we going to pick the Victorian era? Are we going to pick the Edwardian era? Isn't it amazing that we pick our eras based off the names of the kings and queens of England? I thought we fought to get rid of them. Or perhaps it is only the early colonialists. Is it only the cultures that we had before the Louisiana Purchase? Is it only the cultures before we stole all of Western United States from Mexico, who had taken it from Spain, who had taken it from the people who had lived there for thousands of years? Is there a particular point where we had just the right ratio? Or do we recognize that what we have contributed to this country has been a blessing for this country, as has what has been contributed by Italian Americans and Irish Americans, Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans, and all of the people who have come to this country in their own way have contributed to the glory that we have now that makes America the most amazing place on earth. This has been the underlying issue. This has been the underlying contribution. And as Jews, we understand this better than most because we have a record of our own journeys going back 3,000 years. From Abraham, who had to immigrate into Canaan in the first place with nobody there that he would know, with it not being his ancestral home as explicitly stated by God, and having to deal with famine and war, having to become a refugee, having to do what it takes to survive for him and his family, scraping by and eventually succeeding, and then each successive generation having to do the same up until the modern day. We have a record unlike any other nation on earth of what it is like to be in this position, which is probably why it is not surprising that in the Torah, the most repeated admonition, the most repeated commandment in the entire Torah is not keep Shabbat. It is not don't worship idols. It is not keep kosher. It is you will love the stranger. You will love the ger. You will not mistreat the stranger among you. You will take care of the stranger among you. There will be a law for you and your stranger among you that is equal. Over and over, 36 times, the Torah gives us this command in one form or another. It is the most common command in the Torah, and you know what? I think the Torah meant it. I don't think it was window dressing, and I don't think it was just to make the word count work out. I think the Torah recognized that our ancestors had been in this position before, again and again and again, and so we were uniquely able to see what these people who came to our land were going through. Indeed, we even have a requirement in our holiday of Pesach every year to try and relive it, even if we are at peace and haven't immigrated for a while, thanks to the blessings of the United States for those of us in this room, or at least many of us in this room, that in Passover we say, I will act as though I am going out of Egypt. I will act as a homeless refugee with matzah on my back, staff in hand, and my sandals kicking up dust as I try to get away from what I had, and I go forward to who knows what. I will be in that moment of vulnerability, at least emotionally, if not physically, at least during this holiday of Pesach, everyone is commanded to see themselves as though they are the ones being chased by that Aramean, as though they are the ones leaving the land of Egypt. Which brings me to something that you may or may not have seen in the news. I'm judging by the fact that this month's trivia question did not get a huge response, which is, what is the current motto of the conservative movement? I'm not going to give you the answer because you could still submit. Just look it up, people. It's not hard. Just go to the website. It used to be tradition and change. It's been changed because, hey, we do that. But that means that I don't think everybody here is connected to the various news sources out of the conservative movement. USCJ, Rabbinical Assembly, all of the other things that we do. Which means you may or may not know that the Rabbinical Assembly and United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism have filed a lawsuit against the United States government. People know this? Or am I telling you something brand new? Because you should know this. It was not taken lightly. It is the first time, to my knowledge, that this has been done in this particular way. And their issue is not immigration at large. They recognize that that is a complicated, difficult topic that is going to need a great deal of actual discussion, compromise, and effort, rather than mere pronouncements. Their issue is the rescission of the policy that had been in place that allowed places of worship to not have to be worried about being raided by immigration officials. The so-called sanctuary rule. That if you are a place of worship, church, mosque, synagogue, temple, whatever it might be, that whatever else is happening with regards to immigration elsewhere, within the walls of that place of worship, immigration officials are not going to come knocking. Now, why do we care? After all, if somebody is here illegally, do we not want to support the laws of this country? Of course, in general, we do, obviously. But set aside for a moment whatever feelings you may have about the immigration policies of the United States. Just for a moment, if you can. Set aside the talking points and the various chattering of commentators, and ask yourself this. Do I want, and do I trust, officials to stand outside of my place of worship and check the papers of those who come to pray in this place? Do I want to worry that at some point someone may walk down the aisle, shine a flashlight on you and say, show me your proof of residency. Show me your proof that you're allowed to be in this country. I may be prepared to do that on a flight. I may be prepared to do that at many places in life. I may be prepared to do that at places of employment. Indeed, I had to provide proof of my eligibility for employment when I came to work at Temple Israel, as do all of our staff up until the most recent teacher hire. But do we want it here in the sanctuary? Or would we recognize that perhaps not only is this an intrusion into our exercise of our right to worship as we wish, but that even more so it puts into the hands of a government a totalitarian tool? Which churches, which synagogues, which mosques will be targeted? Will it be the ones that support whoever might be the political party in power? Or will it be the ones that have a track record or perhaps has a demographic which is less likely to vote for particular political parties? Would it be the local synagogue that perhaps some official has decided, you know, the people who attend that synagogue, they don't look the way that Jews are supposed to look. And I know how Jews are supposed to look because everybody has an idea of how Jews are supposed to look. They're all wrong, but they all have that idea. Therefore, I think I'll check them out. I won't check the other synagogue out because they look normal. But this one over here, this church over there, that mosque, you know, I bet they're probably harboring some people. Do we not see the problem with this? Do we not recognize that in order for there to be truly free exercise of our religion within this country, these walls have to be sacrosanct. They have to be inviolable. They have to allow us to pray in peace, without concern, without fear, without intimidation. Because we have lived in places around the world where we were not granted any of that. And you know what? It's terrible. That's one of the reasons that many of our ancestors fled from Eastern Europe, where they were worried about someone coming in and demanding your papers. Do you have the right to be here in Berlin? Or were you born in some other village in Germany and you came to Berlin illegally without the proper paperwork? If so, you are now under arrest. Maybe you have moved from your shtetl in parts of Russia. Maybe you were in a part of Ukraine that became part of Russia, that became part of Poland, and went back to Russia again, and you don't know who you belong to anymore. That's not going to stop the officials from targeting you and exploiting you. And you know what the option was back then? Get to America. Leave. And let me ask you, if someone had come after the 1924 Act, if Jews had left Russia, Poland, Germany, and they'd come to America, the eve of World War II, and they'd slipped across the border, and they made their way to a synagogue looking for other Jews, would you turn them in? Would you say, you can find no safety here? Would you say, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to notify the officials? Or would you say, thank God you got away from that? Thank God you came here, because here things aren't perfect, but they're a lot better than that. And we'll take care of you. We can't guard you 24/7. What you do outside those doors, we're not going to be able to do a whole lot on that. We can advocate, we can find legal support, we can do whatever we can. But at least here, be at peace. Be at peace. It might feel like the Jews are uniquely suited to tell this story. And we are. But the Midrash actually tells us that we're not. Going back in the Midrash, the very first people on earth, who were Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava. How were they made? What was Adam made out of? The dust, the dirt. And our rabbis, in their amazing perceptive wisdom, recognized that this presented a potential problem. Because after all, if the story is that Adam was made from dirt, then that means that dirt came from somewhere. And that meant that that somewhere belonged to him. That the dirt of the location for Adam's creation would give certain ownership rights. So what did they imagine? They say, no, God was smarter than this, because, God. God took dirt from every corner of the world and mixed it together to make Adam. None of us are pure dirt from only one place. All of us are an amalgamation of dirt taken from every corner of the world, so that, say the rabbis 2,000 years ago, lest you think this is some modern liberal rubbish, so that no one could say, this dirt is mine, you don't belong here. Because the dirt that we stand on is in every single person on earth. And the dirt of every part of the world is in us as well. We have equal claim to every square inch of soil, and so do they. Which means we have to come up with better ideas, better policies, better rules for how we handle those who want to move and those who don't want people to move. It can't be as simple as you don't belong here. Because we all belong everywhere. Adam and Chava were not only the first people, they were also the first refugees. They were driven out of their home by God, as was one of their sons, Cain. And yet, the rule was the same for all of them. None should harass, none should harm. From the beginning, Judaism recognizes humanity is made up of wanderers. We wander this world, a soul in a body made of dirt, trying to find our way. We don't need to make it harder on each other than it already is. Let this place and every place of worship at least be a place of peace and a place of safety. And let us talk reasonably, let us talk rationally, and let us talk humanely about how to handle the rest of those issues as well. Shabbat Shalom.